Hey everyone and welcome. My name is Anthea. Thank you so much for tuning in to my presentation today on training and programming for glute hypertrophy. So a little bit about me. I'm currently undertaking a Bachelor in Exercise and Sports Science, majoring in Strength and Conditioning at Deakin University in Melbourne. I've been working in the industry for a few years now as a personal trainer and a coach for females. It is a huge passion of mine, as well as being a past and aspiring bikini competitor. I've spent years doing everything in my power to find the best methods possible and grow my glutes and enhance their shape, size, and appearance, which leads me here today. So I hope you get something out of the presentation and yeah, enjoy. So the topics I'll be covering for today's presentation include anatomy, the action function of the glutes, why we want to develop our glutes, as well as programming. So what are the best exercises, rep ranges, volume, intensity, frequency, how do we fit that all together into a program, as well as looking at training, so more so the application in the gym. So starting with glute anatomy, your glutes are comprised of three main muscles. We've got the gluteus maximus, which everyone should be familiar with. And then we've got the gluteus medius and the gluteus minimus. So these lay deep to the gluteus maximus, and they're the two smaller muscles. Looking at the action of our glutes, so your glutes perform four main actions. We've got hip extension, and that's the opening up of that anterior angle of the hip. So hip flexion would be the opposite, so bring your knee towards your chest. So you're in hip flexion at the bottom of a squat, but then as you come up, you're in hip extension. So you can do hip extension by taking your thigh backwards behind you. So in like a quadruped hip extension or a cable kickback. And you can also achieve hip extension through bringing the hips forwards at the top of a hip thrust, coming up from a lunge or a deadlift as well. And then hip abduction, so that's the thigh bone moving laterally away from you. And then hip external rotation, so that's the rotation of the femur in the socket outwards. So the other way would be hip internal rotation. And then we've got posterior pelvic tilt, which is that tucking motion of your pelvis under/up. So the cue tucking your tailbone is posterior pelvic tilt. And a lot of lifters will find that when they combine posterior pelvic tilt with hip extension, you will get a much better glute contraction and more glute activation as well. So now that we've looked at the glutes and what they do from a joint perspective, we want to look at the function and how they help us in our daily lives. So your glutes are the largest and most powerful muscle in the human body, which is pretty cool. They contribute to a lot, and if not all, of our daily movements. Any that you can think of: running up the stairs, stepping up to get something, sitting down, standing up. And they are the primary stabilizer of the lower extremity and the trunk. So your spine, your hip joint, your pelvic girdle, and then moving downstream to your knee and your ankle as well. So that leads me on to my next point, which is why we want to develop the glutes. So the glutes assist in managing pain and injury prevention. Just a little disclaimer, pain is very, very complex. So there could be a million things that go into someone experiencing pain, but the glutes may help in some way with these things. So prevention of adductor and hamstring strains. If you've got a weak link, especially being such a strong link, so your glutes contribute to 75% of hip extension. So they are one of the most powerful hip extensors. So if that is working not as much as it should be, then you'll definitely get those secondary muscles like your adductors and your hamstrings taking over and taking the lead. Anterior hip pain is another one. So the glutes really help to open up the front of the hip. So increasing that space for the femoral head to move inside the hip socket. So if you're in a lot of hip flexion, then you might experience some hip pain. So the glutes really have that pull on the posterior chain to really bring that back and open up that space at the front of the hip. The glutes also can assist in back pain. So again, speaking about anterior pelvic tilt, when you've got that dump of the pelvis forward, the lower back is in that lordotic curve. So you have a natural lordotic curve, of course, but when it is in excess, then you might experience some pain. So hyperextension through the lower back, your glutes are in that stretch position, but bringing them back into that relative posterior tilt can really help to take some of the load off the lower back. And then increase in spine stability. So you don't typically want any dynamic movement through your squats and your deadlifts or any of your other compound movements through your core. So no flexion and extension as you're moving through the movement. So the glutes play a really crucial role in that lumbopelvic stability. So they are a part of the global core system. So when they're working along with the core muscles, then you shouldn't be getting any dynamic movement, therefore increasing that spine stability and reducing the risk of injury. The last one is knee pain and injuries. So the glutes really help to stabilize that knee. And if you've got any issues with that knee tracking inwards, like knee valgus, the glutes really help to bring that more laterally, working on that lateral hip. So could help with things like patellofemoral syndrome and ACL tears. ACL tears are very common, especially in female football. So next one is enhancing athletic performance. So because the glutes are so powerful and strong, you get a huge strength transfer to not only lifting in the gym. So when you've got a really stable core and base of support, you'll be stronger in your military press, bench press, squats, deadlifts, etc. But not only that, you'll also be able to sprint faster, jump higher or longer, improve that change in direction and agility, and also doing it safely as well. And then the last one, which is why we're probably all here today, which is aesthetic appearance, because who doesn't want a really nice set of glutes? So we'll get into the fun stuff now, looking at programming for glute hypertrophy. So what are the best exercises for glute hypertrophy? So we've got 3 categories: stretches, activators, and abductions. So starting with stretches / the vertical load. So that's when the load is running vertically. And this is when the glutes are under peak tension in that stretch position. So think the bottom of a squat, the bottom of a lunge, that mid bottom point of a deadlift. That's when your glutes are under the most tension. So they may not be actively squeezing, but they are lengthened and still under that tension. And then we've got activators. So this is where we'll be contracting and squeezing our glutes, and that's when they're under peak tension. And this is like your variations of your hip thrust, your glute bridges, your rounded back extensions, your kneeling banded hip extensions, your glute pull throughs. And these exercises also all include unilateral variations. So single leg hip thrust, single leg glute bridges, etc. We've also got abduction / lateral load. So this is where the glutes are loaded in that lateral position. So think of your banded sidewalks, your banded clams, the bad girl machine in the gym. So seated abductions, either in a lying position, in a seated position, in a standing position. So you can do all of these exercises in a variety of different ways. Now moving on to the 3 mechanisms of hypertrophy. So what are they? We've got mechanical tension, metabolic stress, and muscle damage. So mechanical tension is induced by passive muscular tension, so that's the eccentric phase. Active muscular tension, which is the concentric phase. So basically taking your muscle through a full contraction of the concentric and the eccentric. And then there's metabolic stress. So this is categorized by that swelling, so the muscle pump, that burning sensation that you get. Usually when you're doing your isolation work, you'll feel this. And that's caused by metabolic byproduct buildup, as well as other mechanisms like blood pooling. And then we've got muscle damage. So muscle damage just refers to basically your muscles breaking down, so the micro tears in that inflammatory response that you get after you lift. Another thing to note is that loaded eccentrics get a lot more muscle damage and soreness than concentric loaded exercises. So now looking at how we weave them into programming and what their place is in hypertrophy for the glutes. So mechanical tension is the primary driver of muscle hypertrophy. So this is the number one in terms of these three factors. So in order to achieve a high amount of mechanical tension, we need to be lifting heavy enough loads within the 3 to 35 plus rep range. So that's a huge rep range. I do go into further detail as to which rep range we do want to bias towards later on, but we need to make sure that we're lifting heavy enough, which is definitely a common error. I think a lot of people definitely limit themselves in how much weight to be lifting. So a great way to gauge that is with RPE. So we need to make sure that we're reaching close proximity to failure on all of our lifts. So an RPE 6 plus, meaning that you've got 4 or less reps left in the tank until technical failure. We also need sufficient exposure and duration. So we need enough frequency, we need enough volume, and enough time under tension. So performing your lifts with control and tempo. It's also really great to move through a full range of motion and mindfully contract your muscle during the movement as well. Looking at metabolic stress, so this mechanism actually isn't causative of muscle growth itself, but the pump and that burning sensation that you get is a good sign that you're working at a high relative intensity. So it's indicative of that fatigue. So we know that your muscle doesn't really care how much weight is on the bar as long as it's getting a really good stimulus. So it's a sign of that fatigue. So the more fatigue that you have, more more motor unit recruitment, and therefore more muscle activation, more increased tension. Going back to that mechanical tension, that's the one that we need. So to enhance this, you can do things like performing high rep sets, short rest periods. Usually they are a smaller range of motion, or you'll do this with your isolation exercises, and also focusing on mind-muscle connection with those. And then the last one is muscle damage. So you can enhance this by controlling the eccentric and also utilizing exercises that load under that stretch position. So your lunges, your squats, etc. You can also do like advanced training techniques like your accentuated eccentrics, force rep negatives. But I wouldn't really say that they're that necessary. They offer novelty and they definitely increase the intensity. But we know that too much muscle damage is detrimental. So there is diminishing returns on too much muscle damage. So this could mean if you're too sore, you may miss a session, you might drop the load, you won't be performing as great quality work, therefore you're not getting sufficient volume, which is going against what we need for muscle hypertrophy. So you need to be mindful of muscle damage. Now looking at how we split up those exercises and what rep ranges are the best rep ranges to use for glute hypertrophy. So you want to split your exercises up into thirds. So you want to do 1/3 of your program as the stretches, 1/3 as activators, and then the remaining third of abduction exercises. So they all have different recovery times, which I'll go into later. They all load your glutes in a variety of different positions, which is great because your glutes have many actions that they perform. So it's got hip extension, hip abduction, hip external rotation, and then you also got posterior pelvic tilt. So your glutes do a lot of roles, which is why you need to make sure that you're getting a variety of different lifts. So having a look at the rep ranges that we want to be working in, you want roughly 15% in the 6 and below rep range, roughly 15% in the 12 to 35 plus rep range, and then the bulk of your work to be done in the 6 to 12 rep range. So these will definitely vary depending on what you actually prefer. Some people love lifting heavy stuff, so they'll be biasing towards the 6 and below, and maybe in the 6-12 more so. Some people love lifting lighter weight and higher reps, which is completely fine. But yeah, I'll go into detail as to why the 6 to 12 rep range we want to be sitting there. So basically, when we look at the 6 and below rep range, you'll be working at very high loads. So 85 to 100% of your 1 rep max. These are usually your compound movements like your squats and your deadlifts. Per set, like say if there's 3 or 4 reps, you get really, really high muscle fiber recruitment. However, because the reps are so low, you need to do more sets. You also need to rest more in between sets. And these do have an increased risk of injury if fatigue is not managed and your form is overlooked. So doing too much work in this rep range, you'll definitely have to be mindful of your volume and take a much lower volume approach because the load and intensity is so high. Now looking at the other side, so the 12 to 35 plus rep range, you'll be working at roughly 65 or less of your 1 rep max. The rest times are quite short, but per set, so say if the set goes for 30 reps, you have quite low activation until like the last 10 reps or so. So you don't have much stimulus for the whole set that you do, which is a bit annoying because the set goes for quite a while. So if you get 30 reps, you'll be sitting there for quite a while until you start to feel the burn, start to get that pump. This means you'll have an increased set time. This might be level out though once you consider like the rest times involved as well as the tempos in the other rep ranges. And these are best suited towards your isolation exercises. So now talking about the 6 to 12 rep range, why is this a sweet spot rep range? Basically, this mitigates the negatives from the other rep ranges. You'll be working at 65 to 85% of 1 rep max, approximately. And this is where you'll be doing your machine or free weight compounds or isolators. So your lunges, leg press, hip thrust, hamstring curls, rounded back extensions, squats, deadlifts. You can really do any exercise in this rep range. So yeah, it is the sweet spot rep range for sure. Now looking at volume, frequency, and intensity and how these variables affect the programming. So volume is the amount of total work performed. So it's reps times set times load. It is well known in the literature that 10 to 20 sets per week per muscle group is the volume landmark. However, not all volume is equal. 3 sets of heavy squats doesn't even compare to 3 sets of bended abductions. So we know that volume and intensity are interrelated because volume includes load. If you're doing an 80 kilo squat, obviously that volume is a lot higher than say a bended abduction, which is little to no load. Therefore, you may be able to do 30 plus sets for glutes each week. So the glutes are a very unique muscle group. You don't get many other muscle groups in the body perform this much volume, but we do have those banded light stuff that we can add in and do that more frequently. So the volume that you'll go for is also very individual. Again, that'll depend on your exercise selection. So if you're someone that doesn't typically like doing a lot of those banded exercises, then you might have lower sets because for you to recover from 40 plus sets of hard working activators and stretches, it's pretty unlikely. And then looking at your effort, the load that you're working, which is interrelated with that exercise selection, your training frequency, your genetics, so how well can you recover? Some people get super, super sore, some people never get sore and fatigued. Nutrition, so are you in a calorie surplus? Are you in a calorie deficit? Are you eating at maintenance? That will definitely change how much volume you'll be able to take. Your training age, so we know that beginners need little volume to get a sufficient stimulus and to gain adaptations. So as you progress as a lifter, as you become more advanced, you will definitely need to ramp up the total work done usually. And then stress levels. Are you a highly stressed person? If so, you probably won't be able to take too much volume. It's also very, very important to prioritize full intensity and effort into every one of your sessions, every one of your reps and your sets, to make sure that you're actually getting the most out of your volume. So there's no point in doing 1,000,001 glute exercises, but just half-assing all of them. It's really important to really give your everything to every single set and make the most of it. Moving on to intensity. So we can measure intensity two ways: relative intensity, which is RPE, or the RAR model, and also absolute intensity. So that's the load on the bar, percentage of 1 rep max. The most important thing is to pick an appropriate weight for each rep range. So if you're working in the 6 and below rep range, but you're using a weight that would be appropriate for the 12 to 35 plus, well, then you're definitely wasting your time. You need to definitely increase the weight and make sure that you're working within a really close proximity to failure on your lifts. So an RP 6 plus or 4 or less reps left in the tank. Another thing to note is that failure is a lot harder to gauge on those higher rep sets. So they are best taken to failure usually, rather than shorter failure. So the lower the reps, the easier it'll be for you to really gauge that RPE and RAR. Your higher sets are also pretty safe to take to failure as well. And then frequency. So you can train your glutes 2 to 5 times per week. This will depend on your ability to recover, your exercise selection that you're using, your genetics, and again, those other factors that I was talking about. So your nutrition, your effort, your load, and your training age as well. So now looking at the SRA model. So basically the SRA model is the stimulus, recovery, and adapt model. And this helps to determine how frequently you can be training your glutes, and having a look at what exercises are best as well, in order for you to increase that frequency of training your glutes. So we know that training a muscle twice per week is superior to training it once per week. So the typical bro split of doing glutes and hamstrings on day 1 of your leg day, and then when you revisit your leg training on a Thursday, you might do quads and calves. You'd actually be better off merging those and going for a more hybrid approach. So combining, say, your glutes, hamstrings, quads, calves on that first day, and then revisiting your glutes again on the next leg day. You can also do more leg work on your upper body days as well. So it is much better to make sure that you're hitting that muscle several times a week than just once. So the exercise type, the intensity, and your training age will affect this SRA curve and how you adapt and recover from your exercises. And this also considers not only the recovery and adaptation of your muscles, but also your CNS and your connective tissues. So basically, your stretches and vertically loaded exercises take the longest time to recover from, typically 3 to 4 days. This is because they have a really large range of motion. They have that eccentric emphasis, so they're loaded under that eccentric portion. We know that they beat you up a lot more, you'll get a lot more sore. They also fry your CNS a little bit more. And if you're working those lower rep ranges, then you'll be beating up some of your connective tissue as well. And then looking at activators and horizontally loaded exercises. So these have a more moderate time of recovery, usually 2 to 3 days. And compared to stretches, they typically have less range of motion. There's less emphasis on that eccentric phase. So you're more so loading the glutes in that contracted position. So unless you actively think about controlling the eccentric, which is great to do so, but they definitely don't compare to the stretches or vertically loaded exercises. So you'll be able to do them a few more times a week than the stretches and vertically loaded exercises. And then looking at abductions and laterally loaded exercises, or basically any light banded work. So it could even be a banded squat, bodyweight squat, burnout, or a bodyweight glute bridge, or something like that. So it doesn't just have to be the abductions. but looking more so at the load. These take the least amount of time to recover from, so usually 1 to 2 days. This is due to their really small range of motion. There's hardly any eccentric going on because you're usually doing that in a more metabolic fashion. And these also have the lowest amount of muscle activation in comparison to those other two categories as well. So just looking at the diagram here, you've got the stimulating of the muscle. So that's when you're breaking the muscle down in the gym. And then you go through a recovery period here. So that's the rebuilding. And then you gain that adaptation. So that will either be gaining muscle size, so hypertrophy, or getting stronger as well. And then you just keep doing that again and again. Which leads me on to my next point of progressive overload. So progressive overload is basically just doing more over time. You need to make sure that you're performing better as you get better. So this is key to any program in order to gain any adaptation, whether that's strength, fitness, performance, or an increase in your muscle size. So you need to expose your body to new demands in order for it to really adapt and change. So if you go into the gym and do the same thing, or even if you go into the gym and do a different thing every single time you go in, that's another reason why your body has no real desire to make a change. So progressive overload is definitely commonly thought to be only an increase in load on the bar, but that's definitely not the case. You can progressively overload like various different ways. You've got technique improvement. So as a beginner, you'll definitely be seeing a lot of technique improvement. In the first phases of your training as well, definitely a lot of strength and neural adaptation. So just learning the movement and your body getting better. And because you're getting better at that movement, you're getting stronger quite easily. An increase in range of motion. So when your nervous system allows you to access those ranges, it lets you know, okay, it's okay, I can go into those ranges, that's safe. You're taking a muscle through more stretch, more load, therefore more distance and more volume, technically speaking. We've also got mind-muscle connection. So as a beginner, you might not have a very good engagement and mind-muscle connection to your glutes, but as you go on, and if that's a center and a focus of your training, then you'll definitely enhance your muscle activation. And then you can also add sets, reps, tempos, pauses, and other intensity techniques as well, so to increase that time under tension. So it's best to start your volume at the lower end in week 1. So treat it as a bit of a deload or an intro week. So example is starting the block at say 2 sets of an RP 6 to 7, just going into it quite easy. If you've got new exercises, then you'll definitely be practicing the skill before you get to really overload that exercise. And then by the end of the week, so it's week 6, you progress to 4 sets on some of your exercises at roughly an RP 9 to 10 to really gain some of that functional overreaching to gain that adaptation and grow. A thing to be careful of is that you don't want to go too hard too soon. So you don't want to try and max out and increase the weight by 30 kilos on the second week. You'll be more prone to injury and just stuffing yourself up for the progression of the block. It also gives you more space to move. So if you go up by small increments slowly throughout the block, it'll just give you a lot more longevity to continue to progress. So you need to make sure that you're training smart. Now looking at different progression models. So when choosing which progression model to use, it'll really depend on the nature of the exercise, how you're loading it. Are you using dumbbells? Are you using, machines? Are you using weight plates? Depends on your experience level, as well as the rate at which you're progressing, and also your previous strength levels as well. So having a look at progressing by reps only, you could do 3 by 6 in the first week. Say you're using 100 kilos on hip thrust, and then go 3 by 7, 3 by 8, 3 by 9, 3 by 10, 3 by 11, 3 by 12. as a way to increase, your capacity to really increase that rep range and get more reps. And then you've got progress by sets only. So pretty self-explanatory, 2 sets, 3 sets, 4 sets. Progress by load only. So typical example of a barbell back squat going 50, 52, 55. And then looking at progressing by the RPE. So we've got a cable pull through, working at 3 sets, 3 sets, 3 sets, but progressing that RPE. So RPE 7, 8, 9, 10. And a cable pull through is a pretty safe exercise to take to an RPE 10 as well, especially being the last week of the block. And then this is my personal favorite, and I find this really, really handy, especially with dumbbell loaded exercises. So say if you're doing a dumbbell Bulgarian split squats, you're using the 10 kilo dumbbells, you're doing that for 3 for 8, and then you can just increase that. Instead of going for the jump, you may not be ready yet. If you did go for the jump, maybe you'd only get 4 or 5 reps. You can just increase the amount of reps that you're doing until you're ready to increase the weight. So you can go 3 for 9, 3 for 10, 3 for 11, 3 for 12, and then you can jump up to the 12.5s, but you might want to jump back down to the rep range of 8. And then you can just cycle that and keep going and keep going. So another thing to note is that progress definitely isn't linear. That's why combining some of these is really fantastic. So you might not feel like you can increase the weight on the squat by 2.5 kilos, but you might feel, okay, last week this was an RP 8, but I just did my first set and it feels like it's an RP 6 or a 7. I can definitely increase the amount of reps that I'm doing. So I'm going to bump that up. That's why when prescribing rep ranges as well, using a rep range, so not like a fixed rep target, is really handy as well. So you might prescribe someone a rep range of 8 to 12. Therefore, using this rep progression model here, if you tell them, hey, start on this lower end with this weight, we'll progress the reps, and then at the end, week 6, increase the weight that week. Or if you're ready to do it sooner, then you could definitely do that as well. So educating your clients on these different ways of overloading will really be the key to success. I know that I always struggled to especially progress with strength. I would just always focus on load. I was always trying to load up the bar. I would get to the point where my form would just break down and I was working not in the same rep range anymore. So I would increase the weight and only be able to do like 3 reps. And that wasn't the goal of the exercise. So yeah, education is definitely key here. Now looking at exercise order, so it's best to start with the exercises that you want to prioritize the most. So if your glutes are of focus, then definitely start out with your glute focus exercises, as well as your heavy compound lifts. So your heavy compound lifts like your squats or your deadlifts, they are very technical, so they take a lot of brain energy. You really need to focus. So it's best to start when you're fresh. So if you're doing these at the end of your session, it's unlikely that you're going to be setting any personal bests. So definitely put these at the start of your session to ensure that you are getting stronger over time and progressively overloading. So starting with stretches or heavy activators there, and then you can move on to your accessory work or more activators and stretches. So your lunges, so your unilateral work, split squats, single leg hip thrusts, cable pull throughs. And then you can finish off with that high rep work as well. So the metabolic stress to burnout as well. Your abductions and laterally loaded exercises, banded seated abductions, banded side walks, as well as your lat activators like your rendered back extensions, frog pumps, quadruped kickbacks, or reverse hypers. You can do these in a circuit fashion, so just back to back, either timed, or you can do them strictly via reps or an AMRAP sets. I really love AMRAP sets for the end of the workout. And that also helps to bring context around RP as well. So every once in a while, I might ask a client to take their last set to failure. So I'll prescribe an AMRAP, and that really helps to gauge that RP to make sure that they are working hard enough. Now looking at some example glute programs. So this is a 3-day glute program. This one doesn't include upper bodies. So theoretically, there would be 2 other upper body days. So this would be a 5-day split, but I've only got the leg days on the screen. So you can screenshot this, take a photo, or get access to the slides later and have a look at this in your own time. But we've got 5 exercises from each category. So splitting those exercises up into thirds, a variety of different rep ranges, but a majority still being in that 6 to 12. And we've got 20 plus sets, and that's also including that light band work. Then looking at an example of a 4-day full body program. So this is including all days here written on the screen. And we've got glutes a lot more frequently. So we're hitting them 4 times a week now instead of 3. So we've got 3 to 4 exercises from each category. Again, splitting up the exercises into thirds, variety of rep range, majority being in that 6 to 12, 20 plus sets, including light band work. So you don't have to just do leg days and upper body days. You don't have to do any particular split. It's more so about achieving that total volume across the week and in a smart manner as well. So if you find that splitting up your glute work across the week and you're able to achieve much better quality overall, then I would definitely recommend that. So we can see here that we've got less exercises on each day. Therefore, you're able to just really go hard and give your all in those sessions. Now looking at mind-muscle connection. So what is mind-muscle connection? How can we enhance our mind-muscle connection with our glutes? So research actually clearly shows that when you actively think about contracting that muscle during the exercise or movement, that it fires a lot harder and it increases that activation. So with more activation of that muscle, we get more fiber unit recruitment, therefore more mechanical tension, and therefore increasing our ability to really enhance the size of our glutes. So if you don't have fantastic mind-muscle connection with your glutes at the moment, that's okay. Your glutes are definitely still working to get you from point A to point B. However, those other synergistic muscles might be taking the lead, so your hamstrings and your quads. It might be worthwhile incorporating some glute activation into your training if you don't already. You don't have to go crazy with this, so just a few sets of a few exercises. It really shouldn't take away from your main session or make you too fatigued. If you do too much, you'll end up pre-exhausting the muscle, and therefore your quads and your hamstrings will actually take over even more because your glutes are already fatigued. So your main session is where the real magic happens. That's where you want to be actively thinking about squeezing your glutes during those, especially your activator and your abduction exercises. So you won't really feel your glutes burn or work that much on your heavy movements like your squats or your deadlifts. This is a great time for those external cues like push through the floor. Internal cueing has been shown to actually be detrimental to your power output and strength in those compound exercises like your squats and your deads. So definitely save the internal cueing and that visualization and the mind-muscle connection of squeezing your glutes for those contracted position exercises. Now looking at range of motion, so when you take a muscle through its full range of motion, this increases the total unit recruitment, it increases that stimulus and growth. So we can actually achieve more total work by traveling for more distance. So if you go all the way down in a squat, you'll be getting a much larger stretch. It'll actually be more difficult. You won't need as much load than if you were to do, say, a half squat. So if you do play sports, you'll be getting into all kind of funky end range positions. So it's really important that you do possess strength in the muscle's full range of motion. Standardizing ROM. So if you're paying attention to the range of motion that you're using, you're more likely to, one, get more out of your exercises, but you're also less likely to cut depth as the set goes on or as the block progresses. So there's a typical case of someone, say, doing squats in week 1 with, say, 50 kilos. They increase the load every single week, maybe up to 57.5 or 60, but by week 6, they're doing half squats. So they haven't actually gotten stronger, they've just gotten better at reducing that range of motion. So therefore, you're not actually getting the stimulus that you want. And deep squats have actually been shown to have increased glute activation than shallow squats. So although you have more knee flexion in deep squats, you do get the glutes under more stretch in that bottom position as well. Now looking at anatomical positioning / your form. So muscles are slaves to bones. So if you put your limbs in the position that you want your muscles to work, they will work. So a really important factor is having a neutral spine when you're lifting. So sometimes a neutral spine is a little bit hard to understand. So I like to use the open scissors and closed scissors analogy. So in the open scissors position, you can see that I've got that flared rib cage there. I've got an anterior pelvic tilt, so hyperextension through my lower back. So I've got a really open flared position there going through my pelvis and rib cage. Coming into the closed scissors position, you can see that my rib cage and my pelvis are essentially stacked. I've moved into relative posterior tilt to that more neutral position. And this is a really nice, safe position to be in while you're squatting or you're deadlifting. It's also really important to keep your rib cage tucked down, especially during your hip thrust, to make sure that you are actually contracting your glutes and not using your lower back. So because your pelvis and rib cage have this relationship, if your rib cage is flared, say at the top of a hip thrust, it's basically a telltale sign that you're in hyperextension through your lower back and you're in anterior pelvic tilt, therefore not contracting your glutes as much as you could. So tucking your chin on hip thrusts also helps to drive you into that neutral position. So if you've got your head back, then you're more likely to be in that hyperextension through your back. Looking at foot and stance position, so the wider the stance, we get more abduction. And if we turn our feet and knees out further, so like that foot and knee flare, you'll get more external rotation as well. But that'll definitely be very individual. Now looking at knee angle, so we know that when we have a vertical shin, we're in a more hip dominant movement, and our glutes and our hamstrings are working a lot more than if our knee is in more flexion, so if our knee is coming over our toes. So you can adopt this in your lunges, your split squats, your step ups and your hip thrusts, making sure that you have that vertical shin. And with this follows usually a more folded torso angle. So torso angle that's more folded, you'll get a lot more stretch on your glutes as well. So in combination, this will provide you with a more hip dominant and glute dominant movement. However, if you do this too much, sometimes you actually might sacrifice the range of motion. I know that when I first found out about this vertical shin and folded torso angle, I was doing Bulgarians like with my front foot like 2 meters away from the bench. I was going down probably like 5 centimeters and coming up. Therefore, I was getting like next to no stretch on my glutes, no range of motion. So yeah, you need to be smart with the shin angle and your torso angle and make sure that you're not sacrificing any of that range of motion. So now when I perform Bulgarian split squats, I can still get into that shin angle and torso angle, but it's definitely not to the extreme that it was before. So I've brought my front foot a little bit closer to the bench, and I'm really focusing on getting that back leg and that back knee kind of scooping under the bench that I'm using. So that's just a little tip. Now taking a look at anatomy considerations. So the female pelvis is a lot wider than males. Males have a more narrow, tall pelvis. Females therefore have an increased Q angle. So we can see this angle here. the femur bone is coming in. So it's getting that inward tracking of the knee. So research indicates that this can actually predispose an individual to more knee problems. So we can address this by increasing that motor control and positional awareness of what the knee is doing during, say, your squats, your deadlifts, your lunges, as well as your hip thrusts. You can create that proprioception by putting a band around the knees to tell them, okay, we've got this thing pushing them in, we need to push out against them. Therefore increasing the strength of those abductor and external rotators, and using exercises not only that abduct the knee, but also help to work that stability aspect. So all of your single leg exercises, so your single leg RDLs, your hip aeroplanes, your Bulgarian split squats, or any of your unilateral exercises are really helpful. So hip socket anatomy definitely varies from person to person. The shape, the orientation, and the depth of the hip socket. Some people have more retroverted femurs, so basically they'll be more externally rotated in the socket. Therefore, they might be suited towards a stance, a squat stance. It's like this, whereas someone who has a femur that is orientated more forward will be better suited to a stance that is more shoulder width apart. They might feel that that's really comfortable. So you definitely need to find the best stance that works for you. Taking a look at anthropometry variations, so someone might have really long torso, short femurs. They'll be able to sit nice and upright in a squat. They'll be able to hit some really good PRs on squats, whereas someone that has long femurs and a short torso, like your girl, struggles a lot more to get into those positions and squat comfortably. Therefore, taking a wider stance might be more beneficial. Therefore, you're asking for less knee flexion, less ankle dorsiflexion. And also just having a look at your squats like technique, it's never going to be the same as someone who has short femurs. So if you're trying to, again, mimic someone, it's usually just a really unrealistic goal to have. And females also tend to present with more lumbar lordosis than males as well. So more anterior pelvic tilt, hyperextension through the lower back. You just need to make sure that they're educated on that lumbopelvic region. So the closed scissors and open scissors position that I was talking about before, making sure that they're really aware of their position in space. So you can do things like core drills and glute activation drills to really build context around that position that you want. So things like dead bugs, planks, all of your anti-extension exercises, moving into something like a glute bridge as well. So you can really feel, and you can see your ribs are tucked down. You can feel that posterior tilt of your pelvis. They're really all great exercises to do prior to your lifts. So it's very important to find exercise variations for you and your body and your anatomy, and what feels comfortable to you. So sure, when you're, trying out a new exercise, it's probably not going to feel very comfortable. But as you go on, if, your elbows are getting really sore, your hips and your knees are just getting banged up, then definitely, by all means, you don't have to do a low bar squat or a sumo deadlift just because, you saw some girl on Instagram do it. So finding exercises that are really comfortable for you, I would definitely recommend. So to summarize, focus on progressively overloading and getting stronger over time, as well as more skilled on all of your lifts. So this is so much more fulfilling than focusing on that cosmetic goal of looking in the mirror every single 2 seconds, wondering, why are my glutes growing? Well, if you're focusing on progressively overloading, then they will be growing. So your performance should be the main focus. That body composition outcome will definitely be a byproduct. Split up your exercises into thirds. So a third in the stretches category, third in the activators, third in the abduction and lateral category. Work in the 3 to 35 plus rep range. You want to bias towards that 6 to 12 rep range. Lift heavy enough loads and within close proximity to failure, so in RP 6 plus. Hit your glutes at least 2 to 5 times per week. This will depend on the various different factors that I've already spoke about. You also want to pay close attention to your own individual needs and tweak exercises to find the variations and positions that work best for you. So say on a hip thrust, play around with a wide stance, a close stance, play around with your knee and foot position. So do you want more flare or less flare? What do you feel your glutes in the most? And the most important of all is be patient, consistent, and most importantly, enjoy the process. So the process will extend for as long as you have this goal. So you just need to enjoy it. You just need to enjoy the whole process, really reflect on the progress that you have made. I know it's quite easy to get really complacent and think you haven't progressed as much, but if you're doing all of the above, then you should be progressing at the perfect rate for you. So yeah, just have to enjoy the process. Here are some references. You can either take a screenshot, photo, or get access to the slides. And I just want to say thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed. I hope you got something out of it. You can find me at my Instagram at just Anthea Woodruff, or you can shoot me an email. Shoot me a DM if you want to chat or you've got any questions regarding anything to do with glutes or anything to do with training. I would love to chat. So yeah, thank you so much.